Thanks again. Cheers. Welcome back. It's been a month since our last webinar, and I'm sure it's been a very busy month for everyone. The timing of this webinar is obviously around the end of the initial pandemic response period that the code or the regulations giving effect to the code refer to. And it's also timed with a fairly significant period, one which economists and the like have spoken about fairly significantly over the last few months, and everything that the government has been trying to do is to prevent a potential cliff. So that's essentially the topic today, and there's a fair bit to try to get through. So as usual, I will skip through fairly quickly a number of slides. Mostly it's just reasonably high-level information to give you an idea of some of these concepts and some good information. And you can certainly see further information from that, and we've got some additional resources and stuff on the last slide when we're doing the question and answer time. So I'll skip through fairly quickly because we often get very good questions at the end, and we want to try to deal with those for as many people as possible. So if we want to kick off right away back into the first slide, I'll just give you a quick view of what the cliff exactly is. So economists, the Treasury and the National Cabinet have all been concerned about a potential cliff, particularly from October 1 when JobKeeper and other stimulus measures that were put in place come to an end. It's essentially a metaphor for small businesses failing, the SMEs that all these measures target, failing and ceasing to trade suddenly and in quite large numbers, which is a very real prospect if no intervention occurred at all. So the end of JobKeeper and other measures combined, and a deferred rent, which has pretty much universally been adopted by landlords to its full extent, 50% of rent reductions pretty much across the board, on top of a return to full pre-COVID lease obligations around your full rent. The annual rent increase, which has been frozen for some time, being applied at the end of this period, and all while enduring recession-like conditions on top of pandemic impact. Tip to reduce things like household spend on the back of growing unemployment and other economic factors like that and drivers pretty much creates a perfect storm which has thousands of SMEs potentially marching slowly towards that cliff. At LPC, it's actually our view that the real danger period is probably April, May, June in 2021. But there's certainly some actions that can be taken to mitigate the risk of failure of SMEs between now and then. So we're going to look at some of that, and I actually have a graph on the next slide back. We'll bring that up just to show you the job of the stimulus of JobKeeper and why it's considered to have been essentially successful to date. If you have a look at this graph, the red line is people who did not receive any stimulus or government support, and this is their spending. So the dotted line on 100 is normal spending habits, and that would contribute to Australia's $329 billion of retail spend. And the grey line up above it is the spend over the period, the 6-month period, from people who have received support, government support, JobKeeper, other stimulus packages like the super drawdowns and things like that. So you can see that had those stimulus measures not been put in place, the retail industry and many small to medium-sized businesses would be in much worse shape than they are right now. Essentially, those two lines brought together pretty much have resulted in retail spend returning to normal very quickly, and the thing that it doesn't really portray is that retail spend has largely been in specific categories like home improvements, alcohol, and other things like that, and not in sort of non-essential category where many retailers are significantly down on revenue, and obviously they're the ones most seeking rent relief from landlords as a result. So on the next slide, we've got the questions that we're hearing most often coming into this period. It's the end of the pandemic response period, but the pandemic is obviously still here and it's impacting on business. It's continuing to spread uncertainty. People are now hanging on to money rather than spending because they're not sure what is going to happen next year, and it further exacerbates the whole situation. So we're going to try to look at these questions that get asked all the time now. How is the code applied from tomorrow on, with today essentially being the end of the initial response period in the major states, most of the states? What protection do you have from your landlord under the code going forward? Are you still able to ask for rent relief if you're still impacted? And how do you make sure that your business doesn't fall off that cliff? So I thought the best thing to do on the next slide, I'll bring up essentially what's happening state by state from tomorrow. So the regulations giving effect to the code state by state. Where in states where the regulation was due to expire today, so Queensland and Victoria have extended to 31st of December. South Australia has extended those regulations till the 3rd of January, and WA extended quite early through to March 28. And in New South Wales, where the initial period is due to expire on the 24th of October, that's now also extended till December 31. In Tasmania, their regulations were put into effect for an initial 12 months or until another date was declared by the minister. And that relates to a financial hardship period commenced on April 1. And it's currently been extended until December 1, and they will assess that ongoing, and they can increase that by 90-day periods ongoing. Northern Territory, they have an emergency declaration in place. It's currently until December. It has been extended, sorry, that reads a little incorrect. It's been extended until December 23rd, and then it may be extended by a further 90 days at a time by the minister there as well. ACT is also similar. It's only extended until November 17. So that's essentially the regulations giving effect to the code have been extended in every state and territory. So the code remains in place, but there's some stipulations around that, and I've just labelled a few, a list of. Next slide, Beck. So actually applying the code after today. you'll need to re-establish eligibility under the revised JobKeeper program. So I'm sure you've all kept up to date with the JobKeeper changes and how Tier 1 and Tier 2 work. But essentially, you need to do a new assessment of impact and re-establish eligibility. And once that's established, then you can fully apply the code for this extension period in whichever state or territory you're in. And that means if you do re-establish eligibility, so obviously many retailers in Victoria will re-establish because of the length of time they've been closed and impacted on through that potential assessment period. And certain categories affected more than others. So protections for tenants from what they call prescribed actions will continue. The prescribed actions being things like issuing breach notices for arrears amounts and terminating leases for breach of lease and drawing down on your bank guarantee and things like that continue their prescribed actions. They continue to be prohibited during the extended period of the regulations. If many people may be in a situation where the new assessment period from the last quarter may mean that they don't re-establish eligibility. We would suggest that the code still protects you and provides ongoing proportionate rent relief under the provisions of the original regulation and code, which at some point hopefully you were eligible and considered an eligible list. The reasonable recovery period can be negotiated at the end of the pandemic response period. So you can still use that provision to negotiate ongoing proportional rent relief with your landlord. The key change in the extension is across virtually every state is that you can negotiate ongoing rent relief proportional to the impact, but unlike the initial period, the waiver and deferral is still in play, but no longer does the landlord have to provide at least 50% of the rent reduction as a waived rent. It's completely up to negotiation, and I would be bracing for the fact that landlords will only offer deferred rent from this point on. That's been fairly well their process going forward is to provide only the minimum obligation. So that will come down to strong negotiation on your part, and we'll talk a little bit later about deferred rent also. If you have had an agreement in place with a deferred rent component and you're no longer eligible for JobKeeper, then your deferred, well, even if you re-establish eligibility, actually, the deferred rent component from the previous period, from the first 6 months, is still due to commence from tomorrow, the repayment of that deferred rent under your agreement, unless you go to your landlord and agree otherwise. So if you're still being impacted, I would suggest strongly that you put something in writing to your landlord requesting that the commencement of repaying the deferred rent component should be delayed until the end of the extension period to allow you to further recover before having to repay that previous deferred amount. Next slide, please, Beg. So I just wanted to be quite clear on these couple of points. Very important, and it's the whole reason why the regulations have been extended in each state. whole purpose of this webinar is around the cliff. There's still significant concern about that cliff. And so the extension is very much about these protections remaining in place, so landlords can't issue default notices, take recovery action, etc. during this period, where we're certainly still in a pandemic, still incredibly uncertain times, and potential impact continuing for some time yet. Can you negotiate rent relief? I've just touched on a little bit, but if you re-establish eligibility for the new JobKeeper scheme, then you can certainly negotiate rent, and there's a complete negotiation as to the proportionality and also the extent of waived first deferred rent. If you're not eligible, if you are not able to establish eligibility for the revised JobKeeper scheme, as I said earlier, I would strongly suggest you still utilise the reasonable recovery period component of the code. And just a quick point on that, it's been very undefined. We talked about it in previous webinars. It's been very undefined as to how long it extends for, what sort of assistance should be provided and on what basis. But it does exist, and a recent court case in New South Wales called the Sneaker Boy court case, where a retailer had a decision in the courts, and the judgment was quite clear on this reasonable recovery period, indicating that in itself could extend for 12 months or longer, and that the provisions of the code apply to that tenant for that period under the reasonable recovery period. So there is some strength in that reasonable recovery period to continue to negotiate support from your landlord, and if you're not eligible for the new JobKeeper program. So I want to touch on this next screen about surviving the pandemic. And not only surviving hopefully all of you on here are still trading and opening for trade. Continuity of business was the first priority for the government when introducing the code. And so part of it has been surviving the pandemic, and the next part is about your business being able to thrive in the post-COVID period. Essentially, I wanted to introduce you to Lpc Cresa's client promise, if you like. It's essentially our set of rules that if you were to apply these to your lease negotiations or your portfolio, with specific application of the code in this case, then we believe that would ensure not only avoiding the cliff, but also allowing the business to thrive through the next lease cycle. So what we promise our clients is that they will never enter into a bad lease when we're representing them, never miss a critical date, never overpay on their lease, never miss an opportunity to improve their lease conditions, and where we look after portfolios or provide lease management services over a portfolio. And we also cover off the IFRS 16 compliance component of it. So we remove that risk as well to our clients. But the top four particularly: never enter into a bad lease, never miss a critical date, never overpay on your lease, and never miss an opportunity to improve your lease conditions are the key elements that we consider in every negotiation. And it's simply a matter of applying the code, the regulations to give effect to it, and the opportunities that tenants have to seek support and relief from the landlords in this case. If we go to the next slide, please, Beck, then to show you that in effect, I've provided two case studies The first one is a NRA member who took the opportunity to contact the NRA for some leasing advice when they thought something was not quite right. And that inquiry came through to me, and I assisted the member in this case without being formally engaged by them. So we provide, essentially a free advice service for a 10, 15-minute phone call to understand the situation. This member was offered a new lease by their landlord, which included a number of clauses allowing the landlord to claw back and recover the waived rent and deferred rent component of the assistance they had provided this tenant during this past 6 months. And the member wanted to know whether that was allowed or right. Our position on that is that would be a lease that you don't want to enter into. Never enter into a bad lease. So we would not allow a client to sign that lease with those clauses in. It had particularly provided the ability for the landlord to call back all of the rental reductions that they provided on a number of different reasons, including any breach of the lease. So I mentioned being in arrears on rent. So if you missed rent by 1 day, essentially they could claim back all of the rental reductions if you terminated the lease, assigned the lease, et cetera, et cetera. Firstly, waived rent is waived. That's written off. It's gone. The landlord can never seek to recover that, certainly not in a future lease. The only time that the landlord should have some recovery of rent in a lease is your current lease, where an agreement between you and your landlord is documented by a deed of variation to the existing lease, where it documents the deferred rent component and on what basis that will be repaid. So monthly over 24 months, this much per month, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly no clawback ever of a waived rent component, and it should certainly not appear in some future lease, some lease that is not attached to your current lease. So that's one case study to give you an idea of how we apply those previous points. And the second is a current client of Lpc Cresa, a retail client. And we were able to use the critical event and seize that opportunity to improve the commercial terms of a lease renewal. Not only were we able to reduce the base rent by 30% on renewal, essentially from about 270,000 to 195,000, but we also managed to negotiate as an incentive for entering into a new lease and providing the landlord with some secure tenure for their asset. We negotiated the waiving of the full deferred rent component, which amounted to $35,000 over the 6 months. So from the previous slide, that's essentially never missing an opportunity to improve your lease conditions, never missing a critical event. So the critical event was the expiry of a lease or the expiry within the next 12 months that allowed us to start negotiations quite early and take advantage of the current situation. Those sorts of concepts would certainly allow that business to thrive in the post-COVID-19, essentially writing off a further $35,000 that they don't have to pay back over the next 24 months, and also paying roughly $75,000, I think, a year less in rent. Now, on the deferred rent, if you've sat in on those webinars before, certainly through April, May and June, we talked a lot about deferred rent equals deferred payment, and we certainly didn't want to agree to deferred rent wherever possible. It's become very obvious that all landlords have insisted on 50% of any rent reductions being as deferred rent. They've really stuck very strongly to meeting only the minimum obligations, unfortunately. So we've had to adopt to that, and new thinking, certainly from Lpc Cresa, is that deferred rent is future leverage. And the case study number 2 there is an example of where we've used that deferred rent as leverage in the negotiating for a future event, a lease renewal. So other ways of doing that. We have clients who have offered to pay the deferred rent amount in one lump sum if offered a discount on that up to 25%. And that's been successful in some cases and not successful in others. But it is one way to gain a further discount on that deferred rent. And as per that case study, waiving the deferred rent when the lease is renewed. That's strong leverage for that. We'll move on to I think, question time, Beck. Hopefully you've got some questions, and while we're coming to a few questions, I've just included on the bottom there some other resources. As I mentioned, we assist the NRA with providing expert advice to their members who contact the NRA for some assistance. Lpc does run a commercial leasing course called What Every Tenant Should Know About Commercial Leasing and Post-COVID-19 Impacts. That's performed over webinars, and you can find out about that by going to our website. And of course, Lpc Cresa puts out quite a bit of pretty valuable information through LinkedIn. And if you want to follow Lpc Cresa on LinkedIn, that'd be great. That stuff should appear on your LinkedIn feed.
Lovely.
Questions, Beck?
Lovely. Thank you very much, Kyle. So we've had a few questions come in just before the webinar I think we'll start with. Sharon asks, are my outgoings payable in full even though we are closed and we are not benefiting from the services and costs the outgoings cover?
It's not 100% straightforward. Yes, the regulations around the code provide rental assistance on the base rent only. However, there's a provision in the code which allows for the tenant to benefit in 2 ways. One, if outgoings decrease because of lack of use. For example, say a shopping centre is closed and therefore cleaning doesn't happen for 6 weeks, then there's a saving to the landlord on outgoings, and that saving should be passed on to a tenant. The other way is that particularly in the extension period, there's been even more stimulus provided to the landlord on things like land tax liabilities and other benefits of the landlord, with the expectation that those savings are passed on to the tenant also. So essentially, yes, you are liable for the outgoings, and you know that's fair enough. That's a cost that the landlord can't avoid. But there's also provisions to minimise that a little bit under certain circumstances, which would be specific to your landlord situation.
Thank you for that. Our second question, is there some form of assistance for retail businesses that haven't quite qualified for JobKeeper but are still closed, and do we still qualify for assistance from our landlord if we no longer receive JobKeeper?
Yeah, I think I'll just refer back to, I tried to cover that off a little bit with the point about the two different ways of getting rent relief going forward from this point. One is to re-establish eligibility if you're in the situation where you go through that process and are not considered eligible for the revised JobKeeper program. Then I'd encourage you to continue negotiations with a landlord under the previous provision, which was the reasonable recovery period, which does provide proportional rent relief by negotiation for some undisclosed period of time. Hopefully that answers that and gives you some direction on how to approach it.
Our next question from Carlo. With the freeze the government has put on lease increases, does that include the annual increase in an existing lease?
That is exactly what the code is referring to in the freeze on increases. The annual increase to your rent, whether it's a CPI increase or a CPI plus 2% or straight 4% increase or whatever it is, that was not allowed to be actioned if it fell between the start of the pandemic response period and up till now. The extension, if you qualify under JobKeeper for the extension period, then that will continue as well as one of those provisions. If you're not re-establishing eligibility under the new version of JobKeeper, then we will see landlords starting to introduce that extension. But reminder, it can't be backdated. So the slight increase, whatever it is, can only be applied from October's rent and not backdated to charge you for the past 6 months in one lump sum either.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, do you believe that the overarching principles as outlined in the code are not necessarily applied correctly in the example showing a 50-50 split of waiver versus deferral on net rent?
Difficult to... Yeah, my view, absolutely. The overarching principles is not about 50-50, it's about continuity of business, giving reasonable consideration to the financial position of both parties. In some states it goes further to even say that if a landlord is financially able to provide more, then it should. But as I said, pretty much across the board, all major landlords, all major shopping centre landlords have stuck steadfastly to the minimum obligations, minimum legal obligations, and that the wording in the code is that at least 50% of those reductions must be waived and no more than 50% can be deferred. It certainly implies that the intention of it is to negotiate an outcome that suits the specific case, understanding that most of those very large landlords would have the financial ability to provide that relief, and most of those very small retailers would not have the financial ability to survive unless they get that assistance. So that's probably my point. I believe the intent of the code was to more often than not provide significantly more waived rent than deferred, but that's not been how it's taken, and unfortunately legally you can't force them to do more than what the regulation allows.
Lovely. Our next question from Jono. If we enter into a new short lease in October, will we be protected by the state regulation of the code in New South Wales?
Yeah, good point. New lease, I don't know if it's a lease renewal or if it's a new lease where you've not had a lease previously. As a lease renewal, I would expect that those provisions and that protection carries over, provided that you re-establish eligibility. However, I recently negotiated a new lease for a client, an actual new lease, so they hadn't traded at this location during the pandemic period. And we had a clause inserted, a protection clause, essentially that the lessor agreed that the lease would be covered by any extension of existing COVID regulations. And there was a couple of other points to that, but I would certainly negotiate that point and have it included in the lease document as a protection clause.
Kyle, so I think we might go one final question, and then if anyone else has any questions, we can send them to marketing@nra.net.au. We have got a question from Arvind. Is it advisable to accept a 12-month lease extension along with a 3-month rent waive?
Is it advisable to accept a 12-month extension with 3 months rent waived? Two different aspects. I think it is advisable right at the moment to extend a lease by 12 months rather than by 5 years or longer. The reason I say that is because landlords so far have not been overly yielding to the market conditions that we are experiencing and that we know will exist over the next year. As I said earlier, recession conditions, softening market, decreased household spend, increase in unemployment, and so on. Landlords are clinging very strongly to passing rents, meaning the rent that you're already paying. They're wanting to do lease renewals for 5, 6, 7 years on the rent that you were paying prior to COVID, rather than it's been very difficult to get the sorts of rent reductions that I talked about with the case study. So in that case, I would certainly be only agreeing to a 12-month lease extension because I think those conditions will be much more in play by June, September quarter next year. And I think the market will have softened and there will be lease savings to be negotiated at that time, a little easier than right now. And if you can do that and achieve a 3-month waive of rent, then that seems like quite a reasonable incentive. And you would just need to weigh that up against the risk of the pandemic having ongoing impact in the absence of a vaccine and further closures. So I would also want the lease to be covered by the regulation and ensure that if in the case of a complete closure, you were protected with rent relief for that event, if that makes sense.
Thank you for your answer, Kyle. So that's all the time we have today. As I said before, if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them through to marketing@nra.net.au and we'll be more than happy to answer those questions for you. Thank you again for joining us, Kyle. It's always wonderful having your expertise for our retailers.
Well, thanks. I hope it's been helpful. And helps with a bit of the uncertainty of ending this period and moving into this next stage. Thanks for joining.